Thanks, everyone. This is our first invited interview on sustainability challenges. We have Professor Subhrajit Guhathakurta, who is professor and chair in the School of City and Regional Planning and director of the Center for Spatial Planning, Analytics, and Visualization at Georgia Tech. He comes to Georgia Tech. He was previously the associate director of the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University, and among the founding faculty members of ASU's School of Sustainability. So very interesting background for this discussion. There's a long bio here. Let me just add a few more points of interest. He was awarded the Mercator Professorship from the German National Science Foundation. He has visiting appointments at the University College London, the Indian Institute of Information Technology in Bangalore, and the University of Queensland in Brisbane. And he served as an expert at Tongji University, at the Association of Bay Area Governments, which I assume is the California, San Francisco Bay Area, and the Atlanta Regional Commission. So thank you, Professor Guhathakurta, for joining us today on this discussion. I thought we would start. We've been talking a lot about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and I know you've had the opportunity to address the United Nations, and I wondered if you could tell us about that.
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here, and I've already had a glance through the questions that you've got, and it looks like it's a very inspired class. Many of the questions that you have are questions that I'm struggling with, so if you're looking for definitive answers, I might disappoint some of you. But you can probably see how I'm struggling through it, and where I am at now at this point with those questions. So, and I'm really impressed by the way you say my last name. Very few people can even attempt it, but you said it perfectly. So anyway, talking about the keynote that I delivered, it was not about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, I presented this lecture around 2012 when we were just coming out of the crisis, the financial crisis around the world. And I was mostly talking about how we deal with crisis in the face of climate change and sustainability. So talked about the financial crisis, I talked about the land crisis, because at that time there was a number of reports that came out which showed that as countries and cities were getting more rich, that is, they were getting richer, they were consuming more land and they were consuming more energy. So there was this, the whole issue about how do we make sure that on one hand we allow countries to become more prosperous, but on the other hand we want to make sure that they don't do it by making us go back on some of our sustainability goals. And then I presented a plan of how do we do it. And given that I'm a planner, I'm an urban planner by training, urban and regional planner by training, I believe in planning and how do we do these kinds of planning. So I presented a framework for planning in the face of these kinds of crises. And that framework involved 3 steps. And the first step was scenario development. That is, how do we develop thousands of scenarios? And some scenarios are more likely scenarios, some scenarios are less likely, what we call black swan scenarios. And how do you categorize the scenarios in a logical way so that you can deal with scenarios not individually, but as a bundle of scenarios, and have a strategy to tackle these scenarios in these, as you classify them in different ways. and then have particular kinds of plans. And the plans, of course, were based on what we were just talking about, digital twinning. That is, how do we develop an understanding of what might happen in the future using the best knowledge we have now, right? And knowing full well that the best knowledge is not adequate to predict what's going to happen, but that's all we have. And therefore, using the best knowledge we have now, we try to figure out what might happen in the future, and then do some backtracking. That is, all right, the future is going to be in these possible directions. So what policies can we adopt now so that it moves towards the directions that we would like, rather than the directions that would be adverse to our sustainability principles? So that was what I was talking about. In fact, I was trying to tell them that, we can deal with sustainability. There are ways that sustainability outcomes can be achieved, but we have to go about that in a much more deliberate way and use all the tools at our disposal to make sure that we get the outcome that we would like rather than the outcome that we would not.
Thank you, very interesting. And we will be talking about digital twins during the Smart Solutions end of this course. Getting more local to Atlanta, the United Nations has launched a regional center for expertise here in Atlanta, of which Georgia Tech is one of the university partners. They have identified 7 priority sustainable development goals, and I wondered if you would comment on which is most important for Atlanta specifically. Let me list the 7. These were no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, industry, innovation and infrastructure, sustainable cities and communities, and climate action. Which of these, or perhaps another non-listed sustainable development goal, is most important for us to address here in Atlanta, in your opinion?
Well, as you know, the sustainable development goals have not been ranked or weighted. So they are all goals and they have equal weightage. So under that scenario, you would allow all goals to have the same amount of importance as the SDGs, but there are certain goals that would imply other goals as well, right? So if you want to have, for example, there was one on sustainable communities that implies a lot. It implies that you have healthy citizens. It implies that you have energy resilience. It implies, as soon as you bring in the word sustainability, it encompasses a lot of the other things that we talked about. So how we actually define each one of those and how we measure progress towards each one of those goals is more critical than trying to figure out whether which one is most important, because that would focus our attention, right? Of course, as planners, we know that our primary objective is the health and well-being of citizens, and that is how what we call the enabling legislation, that is, any kind of legal power that we have to plan cities is based on this one doctrine, which is health and well-being of citizens. And as long as we can show that the planning solutions are achieving that goal, health and well-being, we can have the legal recourse to do planning. So that's an important goal as well. And when you think about health and well-being, then that is also a critical component of sustainability. So I would definitely put those two as being the goals that encompass a lot more of the other goals that are mentioned.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I also have a number of questions from the audience, and I'll try and mention who has asked some of these questions. They're at important level of detail. Let's see. We may not be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we can address many of them. So Seth asks, when retrofitting a developed city, will the driver be technology or behavior?
Behavior, of course, because you can put in as much technology as you want, but as long as people are not using the technology, you're not going to accomplish your goals. So technology is enabling. It's not the ultimate solution. It enables solutions. And if it does not enable adoption and change in behavior, then it doesn't really accomplish the final goals, the objectives that you set out for sustainability. So it's always, I believe, behavior is critical.
So this sounds like behavior of the public. How Emily asks, how do we make it clear to the public what will happen if we don't address sustainability challenges?
That is a very important and difficult question. That's what we are struggling with. And there are other questions that follow in the same vein. How do we make sure that people understand the consequences of their action in an aggregate fashion? That is, individually, when we take certain actions, it may not seem consequential, but in aggregate, it becomes much larger. It becomes a sustainability challenge. So, of course, education is a big part of it, and that's why all of you are in this class, because you understand that. And but how do we educate the public about it? You have to make sure that they also understand that taking these steps are not going to be adverse to their own lifestyles. That is, you want to make sure that there is equitable solution. That is, if some groups adopt those kinds of behavior, they are not adversely affected, and you don't have other groups who may skirt it. That is, equity is very critical to sustainability, because if we cannot project that we have an equitable solution, that we are only imposing certain constraints on one group of people and another group of people is able to skirt that, then that becomes a problem. So how do we make sure that whatever sustainable solutions we are suggesting is equitable? And not only is it equitable, it's equitable in the sense of capability. That is, not everyone is capable of adopting certain practices, right? So not everyone is capable of buying an electric car, for example, or not everyone is capable of having solar panels on their roof. So how do we create sustainable solutions that addresses capabilities of individuals, that is, people who can do, within their means, particular kinds of practices and behavior? We try to encourage that, while others who can do more, we encourage that for others, because that would be an equitable solution, because it's not just one size fits all, but it also takes care of capabilities of people.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You just, I think, answered 3 of the of the upcoming questions. That was wonderful. So Michelle asks, how do you balance the efforts towards sustainability between correcting what we've already done badly versus doing new things in a more sustainable way? How do we achieve that balance?
Well, we do both now, right? We have Superfund sites, we have brownfield remediation, we have brownfields because we did certain things badly, and we didn't have enough information at a certain point in time, and now we have to clean up our act. So we have to do that. And I don't think it is either or, because we need both. But when you do remediation, we try to make sure that the remediation is is towards more sustainable practices. Right? It's not just remediation so that you can go back to your old practices, but you do remediation so that you can enable new types of practices which would be more sustainable. So I don't necessarily see one being more important than the other. I think both are critical.
Thank you very much. Another question I think that's a bit related that's asked by several people, but I'll point out Lauren and Bailey, who both had this question almost exactly the same. Does population density have an impact on how likely people are to implement sustainable practices? This is a sustainable cities course, smart and sustainable cities course, but is there a correlation?
Wow, that is a very interesting question, and this is a question that a lot of people have debated for some time. Does population, size of the population or population density matter for sustainability? And you have people arguing on both sides. I believe that we don't necessarily know what the limits of density are, and in density, at least as far as we know now, is actually better for sustainability than worse. And just to give you an example why density can help, and I'm not suggesting that you can densify indefinitely. I think that there is a limit, but we haven't probably reached that limit. And because if we are able to plan appropriately, plan in a way that takes care of the densities, we can achieve better sustainability. Just to give you an example, the largest city in the world right now, do you know which is the largest city in population, the most populous city in the world? Anyone here?
What do you guys say? You can just shout it out or raise your hand. Shanghai, Mumbai, something with an I. I would put money on Mumbai. The class have some ideas?
It's not in terms of density, in terms of size of population. So it's Tokyo. Tokyo was the largest city in the world in the past 10 years. It was the largest city. And it is projected to be the largest city in the world in the next 10 years as well. The second largest, the third largest, going down from the second to about the 10th largest cities, all the rankings are changing. Mumbai is coming up, Shanghai is coming up, a lot of changes are happening in the rankings, but Tokyo is remaining the top city. It's going to be 35, it's already 35 million, it's going to get even larger. But if you go to Tokyo, you will see that it works, and it works beautifully. People are going about their business, the transportation system works. Of course, there are people to push people into the trains, but in general, people are having decent lives. They're healthy, they are generally satisfied with their living conditions. So that tells you something about density, that it's not density, but it is about how we plan around densities. And they're also highly sustainable. They live in smaller accommodations, they mostly take transit. So if you look at per capita use of any kind of fossil fuels or other kinds of natural materials, they would probably come out to be one of the more sustainable people in the world, even though they live in a highly dense kind of environment. So I think density helps, although I'm not going to claim that you can indefinitely grow in density, but I don't believe we have reached that limit yet. We know what that limit is.
Excellent, thank you. I was explaining from my visit to Tokyo last spring to the class that even the ramen restaurants are a smart city. You have to walk up outside, push the button on what you want, and go inside and pick up your ramen. But very well functioning, clean city. So it isn't the density. Other students asked, and this question in particular is from Manuela, could it be development? So in your list of countries, you had, list of cities, there were cities from more and less developed countries, and Manuela asked, are less developed countries or underdeveloped countries less likely to be sustainable? Is there a link between developed and sustainability? Or are developed countries struggling even more with achieving sustainability?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think development, of course, has a role to play, but it's not the only aspect. It's not the only factor. Equity is a big aspect of it. And if you look at developing countries that are more equitable in terms of the distribution of wealth, distribution of income, you will find that these places are more sustainable than other countries which are also in the similar level of development but are less equitable. So I'm thinking about cities like the cities in India, Mumbai and Delhi. These are highly inequitable places. You go there, and the inequities are in your face. As soon as you land, you see the inequities in those places. So they have very severe challenges in sustainability because they have some underlying issues that has to be dealt with before they can even begin to talk about sustainability. They talk about sustainability and they try to do things in the margins, but I believe it is more important to deal with these underlying equity issues in a real way before they can make a dent in their sustainability indicators. But there are other countries that are also developing, but they are more equitable, and they have less challenges in sustainability. And I was thinking about some places in China, but right now the inequities are growing, so they would have those challenges at some point. But I think equity is a critical factor which has to be dealt with through development. And when we think about development, that is a big aspect of development. It's not just the overall GDP or rate of growth, but it is the how many people share in the development is a big aspect of what we call a developed country.
Thank you. So moving maybe, I think we're still continuing down this line, but a slightly different question. Matthew asks, what are the rewards or benefits, if any, aside from just being more sustainable to cities that would encourage them to become quote unquote sustainable cities?
What are the rewards? I think one big reward is health. Sustainable cities are healthy cities. Another big reward is community cohesion and just civility. People tend to be much more civil. You have some sort of a community cohesion. You understand each other better. So the rewards are great, but those are not measured appropriately now. We don't necessarily measure these kinds of issues as how you feel about being in a community which is more cohesive, which are civil to each other. And that's a big reward, because you want to be in a place where people are nice, are great, they like to be meet others, and they understand each other better. Those kinds of cities, those kinds of communities have rewards that are often not measured adequately. And I think people who live in these places can tell you stories about why they like being there.
Very good. I think this, Stevie asked, continuing along that line, what kinds of checks and balances system could be put in place to avoid things kind of going badly with sustainability initiatives? And then I think importantly, who manages this? What organization or institution would have the control to manage that things aren't kind of going sour with new sustainability initiatives?
Well,
we could take this from anywhere in the world, right? We did learn in class about one such initiative in Australia. I'm challenged to think of how that would work here in the United States, but you can think of anywhere in the world.
So usually it is the public in terms of how they express themselves through their representatives in government, right? If governments are not involved, it becomes much harder to attain the goals, the sustainable development goals. You need your representatives, you need your voice to be heard by the government so that they can create conditions that allow you to be more sustainable. And so how would they do that? Often, through mandates, but sometimes those mandates can be punitive and may not work as well. But other times they just do it through just providing information and metrics. That is, giving you data about how your communities are functioning, right? Giving you data about how families are functioning. How much electricity are you consuming? How much are you traveling? What's your vehicle miles traveled? Collecting these kinds of information, what's your carbon emissions, allows us to see, whenever you have metrics and you look at metrics, you begin to at least question in your mind, well, is that what others are doing? Is this something that I can do better with? Because if you don't have those metrics, then you really don't know how you're performing and whether you can do better or not. So providing these metrics will allow you to be more sustainable, more healthy. For example, now when we go to a grocery store and we buy food, we often look at how many calories each one of those food has. And just because they're providing that information, you're making choices, most probably, that are healthier rather than not, right? So providing those kinds of metrics to you in a way that you're able to make your own decisions is great. So on one hand, you need to know what metrics to track. And if you're tracking those metrics, you need to provide some information about how you can behave differently to make those metrics better, right? So you want to track metrics, and then you want to also provide information about how do you behave differently so that you achieve better scores.
Very interesting. On that calorie point, we were speaking with someone from the city of Atlanta. They're contemplating a sort of system that if you held up your phone and looked at the vegetable or fruit you were going to buy, it would tell you how far that traveled. So that might give you an indicator of how sustainable it is for you to purchase that specific apple versus the apple next door in the next bin.
But there was a paper written by Scott Matthews, I think, from Carnegie Mellon, where he said that how far they travel is a small portion of the carbon footprint of food. The larger portion is how the food is grown. And if you just switch from being omnivorous to, just having vegetables and or chicken and vegetables, and giving up red meat, that would change your carbon footprint by a substantial amount. So changing your diet makes a huge difference in carbon footprint. And that's what happened to places that are becoming more, are becoming wealthier, is people change their diets. They're consuming more meat, consuming more red meat, more beef, and that's making a big impact on the carbon footprint.
Thank you. I think on that question of metrics, Sarah Jane had asked, at what point should the government step in? Right. How bad does it need to get before the government needs to step in and actually ensure citizens are acting sustainably in the interests of the society?
So, coming from a planning point of view, we know that the enabling legislation is based upon health and well-being of citizens. So you have to always compare whatever is happening against that standard. Is the health and well-being affected adversely of citizens? And that's when you step in. So, in the case of, for example, cigarette smoking, and the reason why governments stepped in was because they could show that public health and individual health was being affected. And therefore, you had to do something about it. Similarly with Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, these were all based on the health of individuals, and therefore governments have to step in. When it comes to sustainability, if you're able to show in some ways that the health of people are being affected adversely, so for example, people who are driving 50 miles a day to get to their place of work, and we know that it affects their health, especially if they are driving through a lot of congested freeways. That might be a reason why governments might decide that we have to build our communities differently so that people don't have to drive so far, or we may have to build a transit system and make sure that people are not subjected to those kinds of stresses. So we do have a framework for deciding when the governments should step in, and that framework is based upon health and well-being.
Okay, so I thought we could shift gears here now. We have some questions that are about Atlanta specifically and the United States a little bit more generally. I think everything we've been talking about maybe had a bit of a U.S. bent, but definitely we had examples from around the world. So Ronak asks, what seems to be more of the focus of American cities now at this time? Is it smart cities or sustainable cities? Which should be given more power or attention when constructing technologies or methods to implement?
Well, U.S. is all over the place. I mean, that's, it depends on which part of the U.S. you are focusing on. If you go to California, they have, obviously you've heard about, their goals about sustainability and climate change. Portland, Oregon, Washington, Those are very different places than Oklahoma or Texas or Kansas. They have different agendas, different goals. So it's very hard to talk about U.S. as an aggregate. And states, because it's a federal structure, states have a lot of say in what happens within their boundaries, right? So if you go to California, they have some of the most far-reaching climate regulations and mandates that you'll find anywhere in the world. So it is doable within the context of the U.S. In fact, the federal government, of course, can help, but large states like California can shift the direction of how different private sector entities are dealing with climate change and sustainability issues. If states like New York, California, perhaps someday Texas, who knows, these are really large states. If they adopt certain policies, almost all private sector entities will have to take notice, because these are huge population centers, and if these people are demanding certain kinds of products and certain ways of certain types of technologies, then the private sector will have to make sure that they adopt those practices. And then the other question you asked, which was interesting, is whether states and cities should pursue smart cities versus sustainable cities. In fact, my impression, and this is another lecture that I had done some time ago on smart cities. Smart cities is all over the place. It's a term which came out of some large conglomerates like IBM's and Siemens and Cisco, and their intention was to sell large-scale technologies to cities, big infrastructure technologies to cities. So for cities to become smart, it is not just having technologies, but it is having ways to become sustainable through enabling technologies. Of course, we are not against technologies, but we want to figure out what are these enabling technologies that allow us to become more sustainable and allow us to address issues of climate change, allow us to become more equitable, govern better. So there are ways we can do that, but the problem with smart cities now is that you have these large conglomerates that want to sell you big systems. And whenever you have these situations, cities may become, they may have systems that does not allow interoperability with other systems, because these are all proprietary systems. These may become legacy systems because they've already sunk so much money into these systems that when new technologies come online, they cannot really switch very quickly because they've already invested so much money. So when I talk about smart cities, I talk about enabling infrastructure, right? So one of the enabling infrastructure is having open data portals, or having high-speed fiber optic internet connection throughout the city. Now, if you have this enabling infrastructure, then you can allow different entities, small startups, small groups of individuals, nonprofit groups that come together and develop solutions that address particular problems the cities have, or particular problems certain communities within the cities have. So you don't really have to really figure out exactly what these large technologies are going to do. You provide the enabling infrastructure because individuals can come up with solutions that we have never thought about, problems that we had never really realized that we had. So A smart city is a city that focuses on this enabling infrastructure rather than trying to do everything on their own, using systems that are large scale and too big to fail.
Thank you. So then the question arises, and it arose through several students. Like Clay asked, how do we avoid spending tens to hundreds of billions of dollars to create all this technology? And Katie asked, what's the right balance between public and private funding to enable all of this technology? Or how do we find the balance? Should the private industry be involved? If they're involved, what are the risks associated with that?
So I think the private industry should be involved because you need information about how people are using certain technologies, certain new forms of, say, travel. Should we make Uber provide us more information? Should we make all these scooters that are around here? Do we want more information about these scooters? How many of these scooters are there, and who are using it, and where they are mostly? We need that information. So we have to make sure that certain key pieces of information are made available to the public so that they understand what's going on with private industry. We are not trying to stop them, because obviously it's helpful to a lot of people, but you want to make sure that the information is available so that you can address issues of conflict between certain forms of transportation and land use, or certain forms of transportation and people's behavior before they happen, right? So that's why we need to make sure that the private sector is made to provide those kinds of information. So I think there is a role for the government to play to allow the private sector to provide that information. If you want to know, for example, what is the carbon content of particular products, right? And that's what one of the metrics of a community might be carbon footprint of communities and individuals. You can probably ask for the private sector to provide that information. Like we asked the food industries to provide information about calories.
Thank you. So I had said we were going to zoom in from the U.S. to Atlanta, and then we strayed around to some other questions. So I'll get us back on track. So notwithstanding the limes and the birds, not to promote any specific company, but buzzing around Midtown, Rachel asks, I think this is a very good question, so I'm going to read it exactly. In the southern United States, there's kind of lack of a major passion or focus on sustainability among the general public, perhaps in comparison to other parts of the country. You mentioned California in particular. So in a region where sustainability is not the major concern that's forced on the general public, what are the personality traits or background that differentiates those who are passionate about sustainability, like people who choose to take this class, people sitting in this room, and those who are not? And how can we shape a culture to incite passion about the topic and change behavior? Small question for you.
Well, how many of you have met people who don't think sustainability is a worthy goal to pursue, or climate change? You've all met people.
All hands are up.
and you've met people who believe that climate change is a hoax.
It's not.
So you probably can answer that question better than I can, because I have not met as many people, because I'm not going into the kinds of, my circle is probably more limited to the academia, to the students who are already, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir most of the time. I have met some individuals, but they are, they are scientists who question the science from a very technical perspective. And they question the science of climate change from a technical perspective. In fact, we have some faculty members here at Georgia Tech as well who are in that domain. But it's not that they don't believe it, they are just unconvinced at certain aspects of it, which is based on how they have gone about doing research on the topic. So I do respect them in many ways, but I do know that there are individuals who will never really believe this, regardless of how much information you provide and how many studies you show them. And in those cases, it's extremely hard to tell people that this is a real issue. It's a real problem that we need to take care of. You can of course talk about issues of pollution, right? And you can talk about things such as polluted water, right? When people get sick because they're drinking polluted water, they know why we need to be more sustainable. When people fall sick with respiratory problems because of bad air, they know why we need to have clean air. I mean, there is a direct connection between their own health and well-being and how we deal with issues of clean air, clean water, and appropriate kinds of food, clean food. But when it comes to climate change, it is a much harder discussion to have, because these are issues that are not completely apparent to them, because although you see in the news that you're having more hurricanes and more flooding and places are getting hotter, the heat is going up, but it doesn't really impact them in a very in a way that makes them change behavior. So it becomes a much harder climb to make people understand that it is a real issue that we should address.
Thank you. And I'll say Professor Guhathakurta is downplaying his coolness. We once randomly were placed together in either an Uber or Lyft in a shared ride, and he was dropped off first, so I knew he lives in a very cool area of town.
And I do ride my bike to work, so.
He lives a little bit closer than I do. All right, so just a couple more questions. I think this has been an intense hour of discussion. One on Atlanta and then one generally. Hopefully will help the students, and then we can open it up to folks here and see if they have questions beyond what they've already put up forward in advance. So for Atlanta, what sustainability challenge is arguably most solvable but hasn't been solved thus far due to lack of willpower, manpower, funding? This question is from Catherine.
So I think obviously the equity issue, and that's one of the largest challenges I think in Atlanta. I don't know how many of you have seen any census map of Atlanta in terms of either poverty or high school education or income or housing prices, and you'll see this clean line. It's kind of a diagonal line that comes from the northwest down to the southeast, and people below that line have scored very low in all these indicators that I just mentioned, and people above that score much higher in those indicators. So that is a huge challenge for Atlanta, and that is something that they have to deal with very urgently, because otherwise, you're missing about half the population in whatever we do. So that would probably be the biggest challenge.
And I think that is reflected. I'm just looking back at the 7 priority sustainable development goals for the UN Regional Center for Expertise: no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education also probably across that line varies. Industry, innovation, infrastructure, sustainable cities and communities, and climate action. One last question from myself and Dr. Mohammadi, which hopefully will benefit the class. We're finishing up the sustainability challenges section of the course, and as I mentioned to you beforehand and maybe in this discussion, students will work in teams to develop a smart solution to a sustainability challenge. So we thought it'd be helpful if you could say to the students what you think are the kinds of sustainability challenges that a group of students could address that would actually have an impact on Atlanta or more broadly.
So is there some way to deal with the affordability challenge? There might be, if we have information about individual housing units that are facing these kinds of challenges. And I'm trying to figure out what are the particular types of units that are most likely to transition out of being affordable to becoming non-affordable. So you could have a model that predicts what housing and which types of housing are going to become unaffordable in the next year or few years. Then there might be a way to make sure that we deal with those kinds of housing and make sure that they remain affordable. So that's something we've been thinking about doing, and the recent task force, Atlanta Task Force for Affordable Housing, has asked us to think about these kinds of issues. That's why it was at the top of my mind. So that's one. Of course, you can also think in terms of challenges in transportation. That's a huge issue right now. I ride my bike to work, but I don't ride it to every destination that I could, because I just don't have, I don't feel secure riding in certain roads. So how do you get an app which tells you to get from one destination to another destination using routes that are more secure than routes that are less secure? So there are several ways by which you can help people to be sustainable. And you need to think about these small-scale problems, not the very large problems that you may be facing in your own lives as well. How do you, people who are trying to, who are thinking about becoming more energy secure, that is, they want to have, let's say, solar panels, how do they know what is the solar intensity of their roofs, or if their roofs are adequate for the kind of solar generation that would be worthwhile spending that money, right? You can easily create something that will tell them what the solar potential is of their housing units. So there are lots of these small-scale solutions that you can do. We know the technology is out there. It's not difficult to do, and it would be very helpful.
Thank you. So rather than run the mic back and forth to you all, I'll try to answer a good number of your questions. So why don't we formally end the interview and thank Professor Guhathakurta for coming. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with the group and with the million people. Thanks so much.